Welcome back to Small Caps, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kerry Stevenson, and I've asked Bernard Rowe. He's the Managing Director of ioneer. Ioneer ASX code is INR. And for those of you that don't know, they have one of the largest lithium and boron deposits in the United States, and they are advancing towards construction. But there's a lot to talk about. They've had some agreements in place. In fact, the last time I spoke to Bernard was they had some offtake agreements being done. That was about 4 months ago. There was one after the other. And they've just recently had a non-binding agreement with Shell. We want to talk about that. I also want to talk about a little bit of pressure on the share price. I want to know what's going on and what's next coming into 2023 for all of us that are really keen and interested in ioneer. And as I say, the US really needs domestic production, so we'll talk about that, and also the overall picture for lithium, because Bernard understands what's going on there. And maybe for those of you that don't understand why boron is part of this deposit, we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Bernard, great to see you. Thanks for joining me again on Small Caps.
My pleasure, Kerry, and wonderful to see you too.
Now, Bernard, brief overview. We know it's a deposit. It's the Rhyolite Ridge deposit in Nevada. But just for those out there, brief overview of who are ioneer, and then we'll get into some detail.
Yeah, sure, Kerry. So we own the Rhyolite Ridge lithium and boron project located in the state of Nevada. It's the most advanced lithium boron deposit project in the United States. It's a very large deposit, sedimentary in style. So it's a bit different. We were able to make the end products at site, so there's no sort of offshore processing. It's end product of lithium carbonate and boric acid made at the mine site. It's a very, very large deposit. We've sort of we completed a bankable feasibility study now about 3 years ago. So, we're very advanced, and I'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as we go through the questions, but it's a very advanced project. It's close to being construction ready, and it can produce a very large amount of lithium and boron for the United States, which is, very much a priority for the government these days. And not only can it do what we've sort of shown in the feasibility study, but it's because of a very large resource, it can, over time be scaled up to become a really major global source of both lithium and boron.
How important is your project to, I guess, not only the people that need lithium in the US, but the US government? Are they very keen on making sure this project goes ahead because of domestic supply versus getting their supply from offshore?
Yes, I believe so. Everything points to that. So, if you look at the numbers, the United States today produces about 5,000 tonnes of lithium carbonate domestically. And that comes from Nevada, actually, one mine in Nevada. And by the end of this decade, early into the 2030s, the US is estimated to need something like about 600,000 to 1 million tonnes. So we're talking about going from 5,000 tonnes to up to 1 million tonnes within about a decade. So the undertaking is huge. Now, not all of that will be domestic production. I think that would be just about impossible. But everything points to the fact that the US government is committed to making sure that a portion of it comes from domestic suppliers. And, that's about security of supply chain. It's about strategic minerals. It's about the Inflation Reduction Act, where they've put in actual incentives to ensure that that actually happens. So everything indicates that the US government is actually extremely, and it's bipartisan, committed to building a domestic supply chain for the full length, from minerals in the ground through to electric vehicles.
Right now, where you sit now, as I talk to you, it's mid-December 2020. I cannot believe that Christmas is coming up, but here we are. I managed to get a hold of you before Christmas, which is great. But your share price, Bernard, sorry to bring this up, but it's the elephant in the room for me, which is the share price seems to be under some pressure. You got any views on that? Because people out there will be looking at this going, is it because maybe the permitting hasn't come through? Are people a bit worried about the lithium? I'd love to get your views on where that's at, where that pressure has come from.
Sure, happy to. And this is obviously my opinion, but I think there's two sort of elements at play here. One is the sort of the lithium macro, and it still is a little bit roller coaster like, because particularly whilst China's continued to be in lockdown and EV take up rates have been lower, registrations have been lower than anticipated and modelled, and so when you get things like that happening, then people's supply demand sort of projections change and price predictions change. Okay, so I think there is that macro element of not knowing, are we on track? Are we ahead of schedule? Are we falling behind in terms of EV take-up, which ultimately relates then directly to lithium demand? The interesting thing, though, in all of that, so it is like a roller coaster at times, no question, and it will be for a while to come. But interestingly, if you look at the spot market, lithium pricing on the spot market, carbonate and hydroxide, they're trading at above $80,000 a tonne, like record highs. So, we haven't seen, despite all the predictions that we were going to see lower prices this year, we've seen nothing but higher prices. And so, but, it is a market that's, I think the global market currently is somewhere between 500 and 600,000 tonnes of lithium chemical, carbonate or hydroxide per annum. And so, that's not a big volume. It doesn't compare anything. It's a minuscule amount of tonnes compared to, say, the copper market or the zinc market or the lead market. And so what that means is, as there's little discrepancies or changes in people's projections of demand, then there's a sort of a response in terms of people's prediction on pricing. But as I say, what we've actually seen is just continuing higher prices. So I think in the long term, those things are bound to happen and they'll sort themselves out. It's just the normal supply-demand pressures. Now, I said there's two parts to this, so that's the first. I think the second is more specific to ioneer. And if I look at, where we are at this stage in our project, certainly one of the key milestones that we have to get over is the permitting. And I think that's where most people's attention falls when they look and focus on our project. And, we've been really clear about that. We've said that the only environmental or any other sensitivity that we were sort of facing as we did all the baseline studies and the negotiations with the government, federal and state, was Team's buckwheat. We went and revised our mine plan. We resubmitted a revised version of that mine plan. We did that in July of this year, and that mine plan avoided all the buckwheat. And so we got very strong support from the government, again, federal and state, around that change of strategy and the recognition that this was a sensitive issue that we needed to deal with, which we did conclusively. And on another maybe call some other time, we can talk about buckwheat, because we're doing a huge amount of work on conservation of the buckwheat, and the results are extremely positive. So there's no risk around the buckwheat in my mind. But around the permitting, so we did the revised plan of ops. It's been with the government now for about 4 or 5 months, and we're any day expecting that that's going to move ahead into what's called the NEPA process, and that'll be a strong signal that the government is intending on taking this into this final permitting phase. And that's I think perhaps the thing that worries people is until it happens, they can't count on it happening. But I'm happy to say that we have every confidence that it's about to happen.
What is the NEPA process?
So NEPA process is the process under the National Environmental Protection Act, where the permit applications like ours, which are on federal land, get sort of assessed and ultimately approved or not. So, it's a process. It involves public consultation. It involves an environmental impact statement, of which we've done all the preparation work over the last several years for that, because we've been planning this for a long time. So it's generally a 12-month process, and it's about looking at the project, looking at assessing the project's criteria, getting public comment, addressing those public comments, developing first of all a draft EIS and then a final EIS, and ultimately that process culminates at the end of the 12 months in a record of decision. And that's where the federal government make a decision, is this project going ahead or not? And in our case, we're very, very confident around the NEPA process, that we've done all the work around the only sensitive issue. All the baseline studies were completed years ago now. So, we're really confident. We want to get into this NEPA process and have this project properly assessed and reviewed through that process. And we're confident that we'll get a positive record of decision, and that'll allow us then to go into the building phase.
Can you see anything untoward that might rear its ugly head during that NEPA process? Or do you believe, given the work that you've done in the past, that you've covered your bases? Because I guess there could be people out there saying this could go ahead or not. There's still a little bit of uncertainty around that NEPA process.
Yeah, sure. And so, I point to the way we approach all of our work. And, we've been very successful in securing binding lithium offtake agreements with large organisations, as you and listeners would know. We've been very successful in securing a strategic partnership joint venture with Sibanye. We've been very successful with the DOE's Loan Program Office. To my knowledge, I think we're still the only lithium company that's in the final sort of stage of external due diligence around that loan program. And all of those groups look at all the risks and environmental considerations for a project like this, and we've actually got through all of those. So I'm very confident that we've are aware of any of those sensitivities, the things, as you say, that could rear their head during a process like this. I think we've already looked and taken all of those into consideration. And certainly the buckwheat was the one that was the lightning rod, and we've dealt with that very, very comprehensively. And I'm extremely confident that there is no issues at all around the coexistence of our project with Team's buckwheat. And in fact, I would argue, and many others as well, that ioneer is the solution to the threats that face Team's buckwheat, because we will grow Team's buckwheat. We'll have nurseries. We've already got them. We'll be growing and propagating plants, etc. So the threats that are already the plant is facing, because it's a small population, will be dealt with very, very comprehensively by ioneer as a voluntary step. There's actually nothing to do with the mine at all, because we're not even going into the areas where the buckwheat are. We've got plenty of resource, many, many decades of resource that can be mined, and we don't need to move any of the buckwheat to do that. And I think that's a misconception as well. People think the buckwheat is growing on our deposit. It's not. It's growing to one side of the deposit. We wanted to move some plants, and as I already explained, we decided that after consultation with the government, that wasn't the right path forward, and so we modified those plans. So no, I'm very confident that we've got our heads well and truly around all these issues.
So as you were talking about buckwheat, I had this vision of ioneer buckwheat being this sort of offshoot of ioneer lithium and boron. Now we're going to have ioneer buckwheat. What is it? I just want to ask you a quick question. Is buckwheat a weed, or is it? I mean, I don't know.
I wouldn't call it a weed, but the thing at Rhyolite Ridge, is that it does grow in areas where there has been historic disturbance. And in fact, interestingly, at Rhyolite Ridge, there is nowhere where we find the plant growing which has not had historic disturbance. And yet the same soil and the same climatic conditions exist over a much larger area, and it's not growing in any of those areas. So it does seem to preferentially grow where there has been disturbance of the ground. And most of that disturbance is from past exploration and some old mining, small scale, but that was done in this area 100 years ago. So the plant grows in those areas, but we've been able to demonstrate that it grows in all kinds of soils. It doesn't need lithium. It doesn't need boron. It's quite a hardy plant. We can grow it from seeds. We've got now multiple generations of plants growing. We've built a dedicated greenhouse for buckwheat. We've grown thousands of plants now. It's an easy thing for us to deal with in the scheme of things.
I love it. Bernard Rowe becomes green-fingered. I just want to ask you a couple of questions around that NEPA agreement. Why does it take 12 months? You mentioned 12 months before. Why that length of time if everything else is
Yeah, there's certainly, so it is a guideline. Okay, so it doesn't have to be exactly 12 months, but there are minimum requirements for, scoping is the first one. So there's a sort of a public scoping, and then there's advertising of the, publication of a draft EIS, and then there's public comment periods, and then there's periods. And these periods of public comment and response to those public comments, they're statutory requirements. So, there is a certain period of time that people have to make comments, and then there's a certain period of time that the company has to respond to those comments. And, and there's government agencies involved in that process as well. So, that's why it's a process that is meant to take into account public comment, look at alternatives, come up with the best solution for development of a project. And as it turns out, like the buckwheat is a good example, something like that could be done during the NEPA process, but we've done it beforehand. We've said, no, these are the alternatives. We have an alternative that works here that doesn't require any of the buckwheat to be moved. And so that's what's in the mine plan of operation. So it's a process. And that's how all mines are permitted in the United States. And I think people also forget when they sort of maybe misunderstand this process, and what it might mean for Rhyolite Ridge and the timeline. Well, mines are being permitted all the time in Nevada, and it's not, it's a very, very mining friendly state.
Yeah.
I think it still produces some roughly 80% of the US gold production comes out of Nevada. And I think last time I looked, I think the United States was about the fifth largest producer in the world. There are a lot of gold mines in Nevada. There's a lot of new mines that are being permitted in Nevada. So, permitting a mine is nothing new in this state. And so that also is a huge advantage when you're going through these processes, including NEPA like we are.
So NEPA is happening. I'm going to come on to a couple of other things, but before I just leave this alone. So talk to me about what you do. What is ioneer doing while this NEPA process goes through? Are there things that you can do? Because I'm pretty sure you've got all your funding in place, haven't you? So I mean that's a massive tick. So what are you guys going to be doing in 2023?
So that's a very good question. And again, I think people perhaps think that it'll be a quiet period while we're doing that NEPA, but it will absolutely will not be. So the funding, you're right in the sense that we've got all the equity from Sibanye in place, okay, and we're very close on the debt. So we're expecting to have the equity and the debt in place very soon on this project. So that will be something that we hopefully won't need to be doing too much work on during 2023. So we will turn our attention to things like the engineering. So, finishing off the engineering work that's been ongoing so that we're ready to commence construction as soon as we are able to get out on the ground. We'll be doing obviously there is work involved in actually being in the NEPA process because, as I say, the company has to, get involved in that process and answer questions and things like that. So we'll be doing that as well. We will be looking at the expansion and sort of growth options for the future. I'm not talking about expansion or growth right now. I'm talking about in the future. We have a very large deposit. The costs a very low cost operation from the feasibility study that we completed a few years ago. There's plenty of resource here to make this a much, much larger operation in the future. So we'll be doing work on that. We've already flagged that we've already started doing gravity surveys in the North Basin. That's an area that we own to about 5 kilometres further to the north that we know has lithium and boron mineralisation. The deposit itself, although we've drilled 146 million tonnes of resource, it's open. And so we think, there's a very, very high probability that it'll grow. And, you start talking about hundreds of millions of tonnes of this style of mineralisation, it's a multi-generational opportunity. And of course, that lends itself then to be scaled up in the future. And so, we're going to be doing work on that. there's a lot of mineralisation in this deposit that's a little bit different than the lithium and boron rich mineralisation. And so we'll be doing test work around that, or continuing the test work that we've already done on it to look at how we can also monetize some of that. So there'll be a lot of that sort of work going on whilst we're doing the permitting process.
When you talk about this is a big deposit, etc., from that feasibility study that was done a few years ago, clearly the lithium price has moved since then. I don't want to go into that because that's sort of nitty-gritty stuff, but what's the length of the mine currently? And I guess, given that you're in the NEPA stage, the process, I should say, when do you think you might be getting into production?
So the output would be the life of the mine, is 26 years. That was from the feasibility study, and producing about 22,000 tonnes a year of lithium and 174,000 tonnes a year of boric acid. But that only takes into account. So we're mining at around about 2.5 million tonnes a year. So that 26 years only takes into account a portion of the deposit. We've actually got 146 million tonnes already drilled. So, wow, straight away, and that's all this lithium and boron rich mineralisation. It's all the same. It can all go through the process plant that we've designed and piloted and engineered, etc. So, already it could be significantly higher throughputs. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, what I was looking at was now I've forgotten it because I was looking at what freaked me out, not freaked me out, the 2.5 million tonnes, but you said you got 146 million tonnes in the resource.
Yes.
I want to just ask you, is it going to be a simple process?
Yes. Well, certainly. See, the deposit has, and you can think of it like a cake, okay, layered cake. And we've taken the cream layer of the cake, which is all cream, and the cream here is lithium and boron, and that's what we're processing. And fortunately, it's easier to process than cream, digging it up and moving it and leaching it. But the lithium and boron rich material that is 146 million tonnes in our resource, and it's 60 million tonnes in our reserve, and it's our reserve that's in the mine plan, for the 26 years. So it's that material. It's all very consistent. It's straightforward. That's what we've done all the test work on and all the piloting, bench scale, and then pilot plant, etc. So we know exactly how that material behaves. Now, there are other layers in the cake as well, and they're not in our resource, but they do contain lithium. And, we've talked a little bit about them in the past, so they represent a significant opportunity for us as we move forward. It may mean that it's not going to exactly go through the same process flow sheet, but, as we do more test work, we'll talk more about that, and that'll be something that we will be doing during 2023, whilst we're, putting these other things in place and getting the main project permitted.
When I spoke to you 4 months ago, Bernard, we talked about some binding offtake agreements with Ford and others. And recently you've come out with a non-binding agreement with Shell. I'm wondering whether that pressure on your share price was as a result of that being a non-binding agreement and people going, maybe all's not well in the wheelhouse. My question, I guess, is why the non-binding agreement with Shell?
Sure. No, and that's a very good question. And I have actually been asked that by some investors as well. So you're not the only one who's asked me that question. Now, and you're right that, if you look at over the last couple of years, nearly all the agreements, not everyone, but nearly all of them that ioneer has announced have been binding.
Yep.
But you've got to look at what's the rationale or the purpose behind the agreement as to how you structure it, whether it's binding or non-binding. So in the case of the offtake agreements, the sole reason we did the offtake agreements was to support the debt. Okay, if you want debt financing for a project, you need offtake agreements, and they need to be binding and they need to be bankable. And if they're not binding and bankable, then they're not going to help you with the debt. Now, as I said, we've been through a significant process with the Department of Energy on their Loan Programs Office debt funding. So, that's why we did those offtakes. And I should perhaps add on top of that, but it's an integral part of it in our case, we placed it to parties that are going to use our lithium in the United States in US manufactured electric vehicles. So that was also an important part of it. But that's why we did the binding offtakes. Now, the deal with Shell is completely different because we're actually buying sulfur from them. We're not selling them lithium. And so that was not required for the loan program or DOE debt funding or any other debt funding discussions. And whilst the sale of or us purchasing sulfur from Shell is non-binding, and that's logical because we're not ready to yet purchase 500,000 tonnes a year of sulfur from Shell. But interestingly, if you look at what we said in a bit more detail, you'll see that we said actually there is a binding part of that agreement, and that is that we will negotiate exclusively with each other, ioneer and Shell, around that supply of sulfur. So that's saying that, well, over the next year, ioneer and Shell aren't going to talk to anyone else about sulfur. Sulfur is one of our main input costs. Shell are one of the largest suppliers of sulfur in the world. And so, it's incredibly important then that ioneer locks in stable long-term sulfur. And Shell are at the top of our list of who we could do that with. And so it's that exclusivity that's important, and that is binding.
Well, that actually, I was looking at the announcement. I didn't. That's a really good explanation. It's actually a much, I guess, gives us a little bit more understanding of what it is. The binding part is there.
Yes.
But also it's not to do with your product. It's product you need to be able to process what you're processing.
Yes, okay. That's right. And could I just add one last thing on the Shell announcement is that, the partnership is also about a lot more than just sulfur. And we said, we're partnering with, and Shell said this too, the two companies are partnering on decarbonisation strategies. And I'm super impressed with what I've seen with what Shell are doing in that area. And again, there's no better partner for ioneer to have someone who can supply all of our sulfur and have it very stable long-term supplies in place, okay? And they're world leaders in decarbonisation, carbon capture, renewable energy transformation, all the things that we're producing lithium for. Shell are intimately involved in many of those businesses, so they're a perfect partner for us for many reasons beyond the sulfur.
Well, you know what's coming up because we're running out of time. But before I ask you the final 3 reasons people should sit up and take notice of ioneer right now, before we get to that, we all know right now people are concerned about inflation. Have you got any concerns about that? I know that when you did your feasibility study, I think you had a price of $13,000 around the price of lithium. Today's spot price is more like $80,000. Does one negate the other? In other words, the price of lithium's gone up, but inflation's also hitting. How do you balance that out?
Yeah, look, I think there's no question that everything has gone up. All pricing has gone up. I don't think that anything really has gone down significantly anyway since we did our feasibility study, which is almost 3 years ago. But, fortunately, the thing that has gone up way more than anything else is lithium. So, yes, we used a $13,000 price. And if we were to do it today, we would use a price quite significantly higher than that. And as you mentioned, the spot price is in the 80s of thousands. Now, that doesn't mean we put in that number. That's not a long-term price, but we certainly would use a price that's higher than 13,000. Boric acid is also significantly higher pricing. It's trading above $1,000 an ounce, $1,000 a tonne. I wish it was an ounce, but...
That'd be pretty amazing.
It would be, yes, yeah, exactly. But and we used a long-term price, I think, of just over $700 a tonne when we did the feasibility study. So those, particularly lithium, has gone up a lot. Okay, but our reagent costs will have gone up. Our steel and concrete and labour and everything else has gone up as well. But we are in a fortunate I guess, sector in that the underlying commodity's gone up more than anything of all. So I'm confident that we'll be able to absorb any increases. We will do, by the way, we talk about the 12 months of the NEPA process for the permitting. There is something else significant going on in the background while we're doing that, and that is that we redo the estimates for OPEX, CAPEX, etc., and our financial models, because the board of our company and the board of Sibanye require us to have an updated Class 2 estimate of operating costs, capital costs, before making a final investment decision. Now, we'll be doing that before we are ready to make a final investment decision. So that's something else we're going to be working on through next year. But we're confident that, yes, prices will have gone up, but we're confident around the strong economics of this project, despite all input costs rising, and it's because the underlying commodity prices of lithium and boron have gone up so much.
We've totally run out of time, but I've got to keep going because I want to ask you this one. When do you think the final investment decision will be?
It ties in with FID. I think we are, I can tell you what we're planning around. We're planning around a 12-month NEPA process, and at that end of that 12-month NEPA process, we'll get a recorded decision, and we're very confident that that'll be a positive recorded decision, and that would allow us to commence construction shortly thereafter, and we'll be doing everything in our power to get going on all of that as soon as we can after record of decision.
A lot of lithium is needed by the 2030s. You hoping to get into production, if all goes according to plan, around 2026?
Yes, late 2020. Guidance has been, end of 2025 and into 2026 ramping up. So yes, that's correct.
As I said right at the start, the share price has been under a little bit of pressure as I speak to you, possibly because of a little bit of uncertainty there. Give us 3 reasons why people should be sitting up and taking notice of ASX code INR right now.
Okay, that's an easy one for me, Kerry. Permitting's coming. We're very confident around the notice of intent, which will start the NEPA process. We've done a lot of work over the last 2 years with the Department of Energy. We're going to get an answer very soon on the outcome of our loan application, and we're confident around that as well. And thirdly, this is an amazing deposit. And I think people are yet to really comprehend the scale of this deposit, and you're going to see us doing more work around demonstrating the scale of this deposit so that it can be the dominant United States lithium producer for the remainder of this century.
Wow, for the remainder of the century. Well, that was a nice little wrap up. And one of the things that I've taken out from having a chat with Bernard right now is you don't just turn on a tap and the mine's there. There's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. We're all talking about how we're turning to the electric vehicle revolution, and it's all going to be done by 2030. But as Bernard pointed out in this conversation, there is a lot of production needed. By the 2030s, the US will need 1 million tonnes, and right now they're doing about 5,000 tonnes. That's a big, big gap. So there's a lot of work to be done. Bernard, I look forward to having a chat with you in the new year. In the meantime, thanks for giving us an update. Have a very Merry Christmas. I hope you get at least a couple of days off, because I know how hard you have been working. We'll talk to you in 2023.
Great. Thank you very much, Kerry, and same to you and the listeners. Merry Christmas to everybody. And yes, keep an eye on your screens.
There you go. Lots of news flow to come, ladies and gentlemen. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Bernard.